the boy from Pretoria, South Africa, who became mayor of New York. A true story of ideas, lineage, and the rise of the rest. By Chris Kanyani. In 2005, I met a quiet, inquisitive 14-year-old boy named Zohra Mamdani here in Pretoria. Today, that boy is the mayor of New York City. His father, Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, and family had come to South Africa that year for a series of lectures at the Human Sciences Research Council, HSRC, the organization I worked for then. I remember him vividly, calm, deliberate, and razor-sharp. His lectures drew packed halls. He spoke of how the language of empire had been reborn in the War on Terror, how Africa's political imagination was still being written by the West, and how post-colonial societies must reclaim their narrative. I had no idea that 2 decades later, his own son would embody that reclamation on the grandest stage of all, as the newly elected mayor of New York City, Zohra Kwame. Mamdani's election as mayor of America's largest and most influential city is more than a political upset. It is a civilizational turning point. The son of a Ugandan scholar and an Indian filmmaker, Zohran represents the fusion of Africa, Asia, and the West, the true child of a globalized century. In the same universe of ideas celebrated by Fareed Zakaria's The Rise of the Rest and Clay Shirky's Here Comes Everybody, one big thing has happened. The global is no longer elsewhere. New York, once the epicenter of Western-led empire and elite, has elected as its mayor someone shaped by Africa, migration, and new networks of power. Few South Africans know that before settling in the United States, the Mamdani family lived here. In 1993, Mahmoud was a professor at the University of Durban-Westville, now the University of KwaZulu-Natal. That brief South African chapter, in the shadow of apartheid's end, seems prophetic today. Zoran's victory symbolizes a tectonic cultural shift. A person of African birth, South Asian heritage, Muslim faith, and grassroots social justice background has become mayor of America's largest city. His platform, rent freezes, fare-free buses, affordable housing, and city-owned grocery stores, is more than policy. It is a reordering of priorities. What makes his triumph so extraordinary is not only that a Ugandan-born African now governs a city once ruled by Fiorello LaGuardia, Ed Koch, and Michael Bloomberg. It is that his message of social equity resonated in the very heart of global capitalism. When a young African socialist defeats the entrenched American establishment, it signals a deep shift in civilization's tectonic plates. The rise of the rest is no longer a chapter in an academic book. It is the lived reality of a new age. Every revolution has a lineage. Mahmoud Mamdani has long been one of Africa's most profound thinkers, challenging both Western arrogance and African authoritarianism. His book Good Muslim, Bad Muslim dissected the moral hypocrisies of post-9/11 politics. His wife Mira Nair gave us Salam Bombay and The Namesake, cinematic tributes to the migrant soul. Together, they forged a household where intellect, art, and justice intertwined. Zohran grew up breathing that air. His rise, therefore, is not accidental. It is the flowering of a philosophical lineage that began in Kampala, passed through Durban, and found political expression in Queens, New York. The election of Zohran Mamdani is not a footnote. It is the headline of a new century. The West is no longer the sole author of global destiny. It is one voice among many. The empire has been provincialized, and the periphery has found its pulse. In that light, this victory is not only about New York. It is about Kampala, Durban, Johannesburg, and every city whose youth believe that brilliance need not ask for permission. And perhaps, when Professor Mahmoud Mamdani stood before us at the HSRC 2 decades ago, speaking about reclaiming the African mind, this is what he foresaw: a world in which his own son would walk into the citadel of Western power and declare, "Our time has come. Chris Kanye in Pretoria, later buying for thee." This book reverses history. When Fareed Zakaria wrote The Post-American World, subtitled in some editions The Rise of the Rest, he was not saying America would collapse. He was saying the monopoly on excellence, imagination, and leadership would no longer sit in one place. And when Clay Shirky wrote Here Comes Everybody, he was mapping a world in which power stops asking for permission and simply arrives. Both arguments meet perfectly in yesterday's shock result in the United States, the election of 34-year-old Zohra Kwame Mamdani as mayor of New York City, the largest and most symbolically charged city in America. From Pretoria, South Africa, to New York City, USA, two worlds. One story, a boy once seen in the audience of a philosophy lecture in Africa grows up to lead the most powerful city on earth. It's not just a biography, it's a civilizational turning point. This is not an ordinary first. New York has had immigrant mayors, reformist mayors, Wall Street mayors, black mayors, mayors with TV shows, even a former presidential contender. What it has not had is a Ugandan-born, Muslim, democratic socialist, 2018 naturalized American whose father is one of Africa's most respected public intellectuals and whose mother is a globally acclaimed filmmaker, walking into City Hall on the back of small dollar donations and a housing-first platform. That is new. Dangerously, thrillingly new. New York is not just a city, it is a lens. Whoever runs it becomes part of America's national conversation, and America's national conversation bleeds into everyone else's. Mamdani did not just beat a Republican, he beat former Governor Andrew Cuomo, running as an independent with deep-pocketed support, and still could not stop a 34-year-old African-origin socialist. That signals a structural shift in the world. His platform, taxing the rich, rent freezes, cheaper or free public transit, and a promise to govern for working class. New Yorkers is exactly what U.S. conservatives and some centrist Democrats have warned would turn New York into a socialist experiment. New Yorkers went ahead and chose the experiment. Let us backpedal a little and look at this story again, with the risk of seeming like a broken record repeating what we have already said. In 2005, Ugandan philosopher Mamdani stood at the Human Sciences Research Council in Pretoria. Beside him sat his teenage son, Zohra Mamdani, thoughtful, quiet, absorbing everything. Among the listeners was South African author and strategist Chris Kanyane. 2 decades later, that same boy, once a visitor in Africa, becomes the mayor of New York City. A story that connects continents. This is a story of ideas crossing oceans, of lineages intertwining, of history bending back toward balance. From Kampala to Pretoria, from Durban to Queens, from African philosophy to American politics. This is the true story of how the empire of meaning shifted, how the world's center of gravity moved southward, and how the rest finally rose. What this book reveals. How a single idea, the empire no longer conquers lands, it conquers meanings. Spoken in Pretoria, South Africa, foretold the rewiring of global power. How holism, the philosophy born in South Africa through Jan Smuts, became the hidden principle of the New Age. How Baobab Savannah University, BSU, was founded as Africa's answer to Oxford and Harvard, a living university rooted in ethics, ecology, and consciousness. How the Voortrekkers' Great Trek of the 1800s prefigured today's Great Trek of ideas, from domination to discovery, from separation to wholeness. How Africa is no longer a chapter in world history, it is the author of the next one. The rise of the hole in the boy from Pretoria, South Africa, who became mayor of New York. Chris Kanyane fuses history, philosophy, and prophecy into one breathtaking narrative. He reveals that what began as a father's lecture in Africa has become a global spiritual event, the world awakening to its own unity. Through the lens of holism, this book reframes civilization itself. The West and the rest are not rivals. They are organs of the same living body. Humandiyev, a book that transcends borders. This is not a book about politics. It's a revelation about pattern. It tells of a planet rediscovering its equilibrium, of a civilization learning again to breathe through both lungs, the North and the South. It speaks to readers from Queens to Cairo, from Mumbai to Mamelodi. You are not a fragment. You are the whole, made visible. For readers who think beyond the Mapif, Fareed Zakaria's The Rise of the Rest explained global change in economics. This book explains it in spirit. If Sapiens redefined history, this book redefines destiny. If The Alchemist made you dream, this book will make you remember. It is the African answer to a divided world. Part epic, part philosophy, part revelation. Chapando. Read the book that the world will one day quote. Empires fall not because they are defeated, but because they are outthought. This is the day the empire blinked. This is the whisper that became thunder. This is the rise of the whole, beginning in Pretoria, South Africa, and echoing through New York City and beyond. Now available worldwide, digital download and global edition. Print and audiobook coming soon. Peni Kajarkasarki Nikais Member. When the part returns to the whole, civilization will cease to be struggle and become song. Chris Kanyane, founder, Baobab Savannah University, BSU, South Africa. Chapter 1. The Philosopher Who Carried a Continent Mahmud. Mamdani is one of those rare African thinkers who never separated thought from struggle. Born in Kampala, exiled to the United Kingdom after Idi Amin's coup, and later educated in the United States, he carried Africa in his speech like an inheritance of responsibility. His sentences always bore the rhythm of migration, sharp, deliberate, and world-weary, as if forged from the tension between exile and belonging. To listen to Mamdani was to feel the weight of the African condition turned into words. He spoke not as an academic detached from the world, but as a witness trying to make sense of the scars on its face. His mind was shaped by the great questions of his age. How the colonizer survives inside the colonized, how independence became the new language of domination, and how Africa could think itself free again. Not politically, but intellectually. When he came to South Africa in 2005, he wasn't just delivering lectures. He was planting seeds of thought. His subject was empire, not the old kind of red maps, muskets, and governors, but the modern empire that wore the perfume of virtue, global finance, humanitarianism, and democracy exported in neat packages. He stood before us that afternoon in the HSRC auditorium. Gray suit, calm tone, eyes alive with that soft fire of conviction, and began dismantling the comforting lies of the post-Cold War world. The language of empire has changed, he told us. It no longer speaks in the tongue of conquest, but in the language of rescue, humanitarian intervention, development aid, democracy promotion. It is empire with good manners. The room fell into a long electric silence. No one coughed. No one shuffled their papers. I remember feeling as if I was witnessing something historic, though at the time I could not name it. Mamdani's words had a way of turning the moral mirror around. You walked into his lecture thinking of yourself as innocent, perhaps even progressive, and walked out questioning whether you too had become an instrument of the very systems you condemned. For him, empire was not only a political arrangement, it was a psychological occupation. It lived in how Africans imagined development, how we spoke about aid, how we mimicked Western categories of failed states, civil society, or terror. The battlefield, he said, was not in the deserts of Iraq or the villages of Sudan. It was in the mind. The colonized mind, he warned, does not end with independence. It reproduces itself through language, through education, through the moral categories we borrow from our former masters. I remember scribbling those words in my notebook, not knowing that they would one day feel prophetic, that the next frontier of decolonization would not be about borders or armies, but about who tells the story of the world. After his lecture, a small crowd gathered around him. Students, journalists, and senior researchers fired questions about Iraq, about the African Union, about whether Africa could ever escape dependency. Mahmoud answered not as a man defending a thesis, but as a mentor guiding a younger generation toward self-respect. He had a way of restoring dignity to thought, as if to think deeply was itself an act of resistance. I stood at the edge of that group, notebook in hand, until the moment arrived when I greeted him personally. His handshake was firm but humble. He thanked me for my questions. Behind him stood a woman with a warm, observant smile, Mira Nair, his wife, and beside her, a teenage boy. No more than 14. The boy listened attentively, his eyes darting between the adults as if trying to catch every idea before it escaped. That boy, I would later realize, was Zohra Kwame Mamdani. At that age, he looked like any other curious child of academics. A bit shy, deeply attentive, already carrying the quiet confidence of someone raised in a household of great minds. But something about him lingered in my memory. Perhaps the way he stood, slightly apart yet entirely alert, as if aware that these conversations were shaping the world he would one day enter. When the lecture ended and the room began to empty, I lingered behind, still processing Mahmoud's words. Outside, Pretoria's late afternoon sun washed the street in soft gold. The world felt charged with possibility. I did not know then that the seeds Mamdani scattered that week would take 20 years to bloom, and that they would bloom not in an African parliament or university, but in the beating heart of the Western world, New York City. Looking back now, I realize that Mahmoud Mamdani did more than deliver a lecture that day. He planted me. Something in his words took root inside me. He made me see that Africa's liberation would never be complete until it reclaimed the power to define its own truth. That universities were not merely institutions for degrees, but gardens for the mind, and that if the soil was poisoned by imitation, nothing original would grow. It took years for that seed to sprout. I went on with my life, public service, writing, publishing. But the thought kept returning, quietly, insistently. Africa needs its own house of thought. Not just to interpret the world, but to heal it. And from that inner restlessness came Baobab Savannah University, BSU, a vision of a new kind of university, rooted in earth, green in spirit, bold in intellect. An institution that draws wisdom from the soil and the soul alike, where philosophy, science, and governance meet under the wide African sky. When I think of it now, I see it clearly. BSU was not conceived in a boardroom or a strategic plan. It was born the day Mahmoud Mamdani stood in that lecture hall and said that empire now. Where's the mask of benevolence? That was the day I understood that the next empire to fall would not be political. It would be intellectual. And perhaps the truest act of decolonization is to build a university, one idea at a time. Chapter 2. The family that bridged civilizations. It is rare to meet a family that embodies the union of continents. Rarer still to find one that fuses intellect and art, faith and reason, struggle and beauty. The Mamdanis were such a family. While Mahmoud dissected the architecture of empire, Mira Nair, his wife, built emotional bridges across it. She did not write manifestos. She directed films. Her cinema, Salam Bombay, A Monsoon Wedding, The Namesake, gave the global South a human voice long before the phrase representation became fashionable. Through her camera, the poor were not pitied. They were dignified. The migrant was not a victim. They were the carrier of new worlds. Their partnership fascinated me. Not just husband and wife, but intellectual and artist. United by one purpose, to tell the untold story of the marginalized with elegance, not anger. When I saw them together in Pretoria, I understood that decolonization did not have to be violent or ideological. It could be creative. Mahmoud's lectures were like chisels, carving through illusion. Mira's presence was like sunlight, softening what his intellect struck. Between them was Zohran, their son, absorbing both worlds, the scholar's clarity and the artist's empathy. You could feel the completeness of their union. It was not just a family. It was a living metaphor for global humanity. Africa, Asia, and the West, braided into one household. And somehow, that realization changed the way I saw Africa's place in the world. For too long, our continent had been made to feel like a spectator in civilization's theater. The West performed, we applauded. But in the Mamdani's living example, I saw something quietly revolutionary. The African scholar teaching the world, the Indian artist interpreting the world, and their son, shaped by both, preparing to lead the world. It was proof that civilization is not a single river flowing from Europe outward. It is a confluence, a meeting of waters, and that insight stayed with me. Years later, as I began shaping my own vision for Baobab Savannah University, BSU, I found myself returning to that family, not as personalities, but as symbols. I wanted BSU to be a bridge like them, where disciplines converse, where science sits beside poetry, where ethics meets engineering, where intellect and imagination raise each other like two hands in prayer. Africa has known too many institutions built on imitation, universities that reproduce Western models but ignore African reality. What I saw in the Mamdani household was a living prototype of synthesis, what Smuts once called holism, the art of uniting opposites without erasing their difference. BSU, in its essence, was conceived in that same spirit. It was to be an African university with the curiosity of the East and the analytical rigor of the West, a green sanctuary where knowledge, art, and earth coexist. If Mahmoud planted the seed, Mira watered it with color and emotion. Through them, I learned that the true university is not a place of walls and timetables. It is a home where ideas from every civilization are allowed to meet, argue, and fall in love. And perhaps that is what the future of Africa demands. Not more slogans of decolonization, but gardens of reconciliation. Places where we stop imitating and start integrating. Where the African child learns that truth has no passport. Because when I remember the Mamdanis, the philosopher, the filmmaker, and the boy, I see the shape of a new civilization forming quietly, not in power or policy, but in the intimacy of a family that dared to merge the world. And it was in witnessing that harmony that the second root of BSU sank into me. The belief that knowledge and art, reason and beauty, Africa and the world, belong not on different pages but in the same book. Chapter 3. The Books That Foretold the Future. There are moments in life when you read a book, and you feel that it is not you reading the book. The book is reading you. It peers into your unspoken questions, your unfinished philosophies, and whispers, "I know where this is going." That was how I felt when I first read Fareed Zakaria's The Rise of the Rest and Clay Shirky's Here Comes Everybody. These were not just books, they were prophecies bound in paper. They carried the same pulse I had first heard in Mahmoud Mamdani's lectures, the dawning realization that power was shifting, not through revolution, but through connection. Zakaria argued that the 21st century would not belong to the West alone. The monopoly of civilization was ending. From Shanghai to São Paulo, from Lagos to Bangalore, new centers of influence were rising quietly and confidently. He called it the rise of the rest. When I read those words, I underlined them so hard my pen tore the page. Because I had seen the rest. I had seen them in Pretoria lecture halls, in township schools, in dusty rural libraries. People who carried the spark of genius but had been told, subtly and systematically, that their place was to follow, not to lead. Clay Shirky, on the other hand, spoke about the digital revolution, how technology was dissolving the barriers between the governed and the governors, between the expert and the crowd. "Here comes everybody," he declared, meaning that history's gatekeepers could no longer hold the gates shut. The two books were written in different idioms, one about geopolitics, the other about technology. But together, they formed the map of a world being reborn. They confirmed what Mamdani had hinted at years earlier, that the empire of ideas was collapsing, and the provinces were now finding their own voice. I remember sitting in my small study, late at night, surrounded by highlighted passages and coffee stains, realizing that Africa's next revolution would not be waged with guns, but with knowledge infrastructure, with universities, libraries, data, and disciplined minds. That was when the seed inside me, planted by Mahmoud, watered by Mira, began to stir. I started imagining what it would mean for Africa to have a university not modeled on Oxford or Harvard, but on its own ecology and spirit, a place where philosophy and soil met, where students studied both Plato and rainfall, both Aristotle and energy grids, both governance and grain. It seemed then like a dream too large for one person, but I knew it was necessary, because while the West debated the future, Africa was already living it. We were the laboratory of the world's contradictions, inequality and innovation, poverty and creativity, despair and transcendence, all colliding daily in our streets. In that chaos, I saw a design waiting to be born. When Zohra Mamdani began his political rise years later, I recognized in him the same logic that Zakaria and Shirky described, the power of the rest finding its form. But to me, it was more personal. It was as if a small, shy boy I once saw in Pretoria had stepped into the very world those books foresaw and claimed it. He had crossed the invisible line between the classroom and the city, between theory and governance. And I thought to myself, perhaps these books were not just about geopolitics. Perhaps they were letters to the future. They were messages to people like us, Africans, thinkers, educators, and reformers, reminding us that history's stage is no longer guarded. The lights are open. Anyone who dares may step forward. When I look back now, I see that those books were the first green shoots breaking through the soil. They told me that what Mahmoud had planted was not an isolated thought. It was part of a global shift. The soil was ready. The roots of BSU began to stretch quietly, invisibly, through me, toward a vision that would marry African reality with global imagination. Because the rise of the rest was not only about nations, it was about minds. And Africa's time, our intellectual time, had come. Chapter 4. The Campaign That Rewrote History. When the campaign began, it looked like one of those idealistic experiments destined to end in applause, not victory. Zohra Kwame Mamdani, the quiet boy I had met 2 decades earlier in Pretoria, was running for mayor of New York City, the citadel of global capitalism, the fortress of Wall Street, and the stage where power rarely changes hands without permission. The odds were impossible. He was young, African-born, Muslim, and openly socialist in a city whose skyline was built by bankers. But the impossible is precisely where history hides its surprises. The making of a new language. From the first rally, it was clear that this was not a traditional campaign. Zohran didn't speak like a politician. He spoke like a teacher. His sentences were uncluttered by political varnish. He said words like justice, affordability, solidarity, not as slogans, but as moral coordinates. He didn't promise prosperity, he promised balance. He didn't flatter the wealthy, he reassured the forgotten. He didn't bow to the city's billionaires. He walked with its bus drivers, and in that simplicity lay something revolutionary. When he stood before the crowd, I could hear faint echoes of his father's voice, that calm dissection of empire, the same cadence of moral logic. But Zohran had transformed it. He was not analyzing empire anymore. He was governing its capital, the platform of the people. His campaign was built around ideas that sounded naive to experts, but resonated with the public. Freeze rents, because housing is not a privilege, but the foundation of dignity. Make buses free, because mobility is a human right in a working city. City-owned grocery stores, because no child should go hungry in a metropolis of skyscrapers. Radical affordability, not as a charity, but as a civic principle. Critics dismissed him as a dreamer. Editorials sneered. Talk shows laughed. But beneath that noise, something ancient and powerful stirred. The moral imagination of ordinary people. They saw in him not a politician, but a mirror, someone who understood what it means to struggle without losing grace. His rallies swelled like gospel meetings, not with fanaticism, but with quiet conviction. Taxi drivers, single mothers, nurses, teachers, they filled the streets because for once, someone spoke their language without condescension. The Night Empire. Blinked election night was a storm of disbelief. Pundits scrambled for explanations. Donors vanished into silence, and the old political machinery creaked under the weight of something it had long forgotten, the will of the people. When the results came in, Zohran Mamdani, mayor of New York City. I felt the same awe I had felt in that HSRC lecture hall 20 years earlier, but this time, it wasn't theory. It was history made flesh. I imagined Mahmoud watching from his study, a faint smile beneath the calm. The empire he once described as having good manners had just been politely overturned. That night, I wrote in my journal, "When empire falls, it doesn't always fall to armies. Sometimes it falls to children raised on truth." The lesson for Africa Zohran's victory was not just his own. It was proof that the intellectual and moral inheritance of Africa can compete on the world's highest stage, not as a beggar's plea, but as a teacher's gift. It showed that the mind of Africa could produce not only poets and philosophers, but leaders capable of reimagining civilization itself. In him, I saw what the future of leadership could be. Not the domination of others, but the elevation of all. He reminded the world that power can still be ethical, and that empathy is not weakness, but a renewable form of strength. For me, it also sharpened the mission of Baobab Savannah University, BSU. BSU could not be a university of theory alone. It had to train conscience as much as intellect. It had to produce leaders who govern like philosophers, not actors, people who see policy as an instrument of healing, not manipulation. I realized that the world doesn't fall apart because we lack leaders. It collapses because we lack philosophical leadership, the kind that connects ethics with action, vision with service. Zohran embodied that synthesis. The seed in bloom. When I look back now, I see a clear progression. Mahmoud planted the seed of intellectual freedom. Mira watered it with art and emotion. The books, Zakaria, Shirky, and others, germinated the soil of global consciousness. And Zohran's campaign was the first green shoot, bursting through the asphalt of modern cynicism. From that lineage, BSU drew its courage and to stand against conformity, to teach leadership as moral craftsmanship, and to believe that Africa can shape the world not by imitation, but by imagination. Because if the boy from Pretoria can rise to lead New York City, then every African child sitting in a dusty classroom carries the same possibility. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson. Empires don't truly end when their armies withdraw. They end when their former subjects begin to lead with grace. Chapter 5. What it means for South Africa when I saw the headlines. Zohra Mamdani wins New York mayoral election. Something inside me went utterly still. It was not pride alone, nor disbelief. It was a deeper tremor of recognition, because I realized that his victory was not merely a triumph of one man. It was a reflection of what Africa could have been, and still might be. A mirror to our unfinished work. South Africa was meant to be the world's moral compass after apartheid. We had the blueprint: forgiveness, intellect, diversity, democracy. But somewhere between liberation and luxury, the compass needle began to spin. We built political monuments instead of moral ones. We celebrated freedom, but neglected discipline. We mastered the language of transformation, yet forgot the grammar of integrity. As I watched the son of an African scholar take the helm of the West's greatest city, I felt a strange mixture of joy and lament. Joy, because his ascent vindicated Africa's intellectual worth. Lament, because it exposed our paralysis. New York had just elected a man we would have overlooked at home. Too young, too intellectual, too different, too principled to survive our politics. Yet the world that once colonized us was now ready to be led by the kind of mind Africa often ignores. That realization was not bitter. It was awakening. It forced me to confront the truth. South Africa's struggle was never just against apartheid. It was against mental dependency, the lingering belief that greatness must always come from elsewhere. Reclaiming the African mind. Mamdani once said that the colonized mind survives long after the colonizer has left. And he was right. You can change flags, rewrite constitutions, even rename cities, but if the mind still kneels, the nation remains unfree. Our liberation will only be complete when we no longer need validation from abroad to believe in our own intellect. When the next Zohran arises from Soweto or Soshanguve or Khayelitsha, we must not wait for the New York Times to tell us he matters. That, I realized, is the silent revolution BSU must wage, the decolonization of self-doubt. Because the problem is not that Africans cannot think. It is that too few are taught to trust their own thinking. The birth of a new educational philosophy. That night, while reading the news on my screen, I reopened my notebook from 2005, the one where I had written Mamdani's line, "Empire now speaks in the language of rescue." I looked at that sentence again, and beside it, I wrote my own reply. Africa must learn to rescue itself. That is the foundation of Baobab Savannah University, BSU. A university not built in ivory towers, but under open skies. A place where thought returns to its natural habitat, the land, the people, the community. A place that teaches that the intellect is not foreign. It is indigenous. In BSU's classrooms, there would be no separation between soil and philosophy, between governance and conscience, between intellect and empathy. Students would study the past not to escape it, but to redeem it. They would learn that every broken system is an invitation to design a better one, because knowledge, I realized, must no longer be borrowed. It must be grown, like crops that thrive only when planted in native soil. The lesson Zohran gave back. When I met Zohran in 2005, he was a child absorbing his father's wisdom. When I saw him in 2025, through the screen of a global broadcast, I understood that he had become a teacher in his own right, teaching the world that morality and modernity need not be enemies. He had returned to the same theme his father taught us 2 decades earlier, that the empire may be powerful, but it is not eternal. It falls quietly, the day its former subjects learn to lead themselves with dignity. And perhaps, unknowingly, Zohran gave South Africa back its own reflection. A reminder that the future belongs to those who believe that thought is power, that integrity is strategy, and that the greatest revolution begins in the human mind. The continuation of the seed by then. The seed Mahmoud planted in me had grown tall, no longer a thought, but a tree with roots in South African soil. The Baobab Savannah University was its trunk, reaching upward, collecting the sunlight of Africa's intellectual inheritance. Every branch represented something I had learned along the way. From Mahmoud, the discipline of truth. From Mira, the artistry of expression. From Zakaria and Shirki, the universality of networks. From Zohran, the courage to act on belief. Together, they form the canopy under which BSU now grows, a living idea that knowledge, like the baobab, must outlive generations and withstand every drought of hope. Epilogue. The meaning of home. When I think of all this, the lectures, the books, the victories, I return to one quiet image, a teenage boy in Pretoria, standing beside his father, listening to a lecture on empire. He could not have known that 2 decades later, he would lead the greatest city of that empire, and that somewhere in Africa, one listener from that same hall would be building a university inspired by that very moment. That is what South Africa means to me now, not a country still waiting to be saved, but a sacred ground where ideas are planted, ideas that one day walk the earth in human form, changing the course of nations. And if you ask me what it means for South Africa, that a boy once seen in our lecture halls is now the mayor of New York City, I would say this: it means the African century has already begun. Quietly, intellectually, irreversibly. And its capital is not a city, but a state of mind. Chapter 6. The day empire blinked. There are moments when history exhales, softly, imperceptibly, and the world tilts. No cannon fires, no armies march, yet something vast and ancient moves. That was the day empire blinked. When the results were confirmed, Zohran Kwame Mamdani, mayor of New York City, the world looked up from its screens in disbelief. But I sat very still, because I had seen this moment before, not in prophecy or dream, but in a lecture hall in Pretoria 20 years earlier, where a Ugandan scholar had spoken of empire's endurance and its eventual exhaustion. He had warned that power now spoke the language of benevolence, that it conquered not with bayonets, but with ideas and narratives. And now his own son had walked calmly into the citadel of those narratives and turned on the lights. The empire, polite and confident, blinked, the quiet reversal. It was not rebellion that overthrew it. It was reflection. No slogans, no barricades, just a young African mind disciplined by philosophy and softened by compassion. In that moment, I realized something fundamental. The 21st century will not belong to those who shout the loudest, but to those who think the deepest. The victory of Zohran Mamdani was not a political event. It was a civilizational correction. It signified that the margins had begun to speak, and the center was learning to listen. That power could still be human. That intellect, long exiled from politics, had finally returned home. And for me, seated half a world away in Pretoria, it felt like the completion of a long circle. The circle closes in Africa, when Mahmoud came to the Human Sciences Research Council in 2005. He was not merely a visiting professor, he was a messenger carrying an unfinished conversation between Africa and the world. I remember the way he paused before answering questions, his silence more eloquent than speech. He made thinking feel like prayer. That afternoon, something in me shifted. He had planted a seed of intellectual rebellion, not against authority, but against blindness. He showed me that the most radical act an African can perform is to think independently and organize ethically. Years passed. Governments changed, slogans came and went, but that seed never died. It lay dormant beneath the noise until the day empire blinked, and I finally understood what it was asking of me. It was not asking me to celebrate the Mamdanis. It was asking me to continue their work, the mandate of the baobab. And so Baobab Savannah University was born, not from policy, but from remembrance. It rose from the red soil like the tree whose name it bears, ancient, patient, indestructible. Its classrooms were not designed to imitate Europe. They were shaped by the logic of the savannah, wide, open, alive with conversation. Here, philosophy sits beside agriculture, governance beside ecology, art beside law. Here, every discipline speaks to another, as rivers merge beneath the same sky. Here, students learn that intelligence is not imported. It is cultivated, that the mind, like the soil, yields only when treated with reverence. BSU is not a university of degrees. It is a university of becoming. It teaches that leadership is not domination, but balance. That to build a nation, one must first build an inner constitution of ethics. This, I now see, is the true inheritance of that 2005 moment. Mahmud gave us the thought, Mira gave it rhythm, Zohran gave it motion, and BSU gave it a home. The new geography of power. When empire blinked, it was not the end of the West. It was the beginning of the world. Power no longer flows in one direction. New York can learn from Nairobi. Cambridge can learn from Cape Town. Harvard may soon quote Scrawl. For too long, Africa was the background of other people's stories. Now we write the foreground. Not with vengeance, but with vision. Not to erase, but to enlighten. And when historians of the next century look back, they will not measure this age by wars or inventions, but by a quiet shift in consciousness, the day the world stopped asking, "Can anything good come out of Africa?" and began to answer, "Everything that matters already has." Chapter 6. The Day Empire Blinked. The day empire blinked was not recorded in gunfire or revolution. There were no barricades, no manifestos pinned to city walls, no exiles returning from secret bases. It happened quietly. Through the ballot, through the mind, through the voice of a man whose ancestry the empire had once dismissed. That day, the West turned its gaze eastward, not to conquer, but to understand. For the first time, New York City, the self-declared capital of modern civilization, had chosen a mayor born on African soil. No one could quite explain it. The analysts spoke of demographics, policies, youth movements, unions. But those of us who had seen the story from the beginning knew that something far deeper had unfolded. History had changed direction. The tide had turned from conquest to consciousness. The shock in the Citadel Inn. The high offices of Wall Street, a new unease hung in the air. A mayor who quoted poets, who spoke of justice as infrastructure, who declared housing a human right. This was not supposed to happen in the city that invented billionaires. The newspapers called him idealistic. The financiers called him dangerous. But the people, those who swept the streets, drove the subways, nursed the sick, and delivered the meals, called him ours. And there, in the tension between ridicule and reverence, the empire blinked. It realized that it had built skyscrapers, but lost sight of humanity. The ghost of the lecture hall. That evening, as news networks replayed the victory speech, my mind drifted back 20 years to that modest lecture hall at the Human Sciences Research Council in Pretoria. The room had smelled faintly of paper and old carpet. Mahmoud Mamdani had stood before us, not as a celebrity scholar, but as a quiet revolutionary. He had warned that empire would not die with its colonies. It would reinvent itself through narrative, through who gets to tell the story of civilization. To control the story, he said, is to control the future. I didn't know it then, but that line would follow me for decades, haunting my career, guiding my thoughts, until the night his son took an oath to lead the world's greatest city, because that oath, taken in New York, was the completion of a sentence that had begun in Pretoria. The son and the father, the boy I had met in 2005, was now standing at the podium of history. And in that moment, he was not only Mahmud's son, he was Africa's reply to the empire's arrogance. The son of the colonized now governed the capital of the colonizer, but there was no vengeance in his voice, no bitterness, only balance. He spoke of dignity, of inclusion, of the quiet power of the working class. He quoted Baldwin and Biko in the same breath. He reminded the world that democracy is not the privilege of the powerful, but the inheritance of the humble. And when he ended his speech, the applause sounded like the echo of all our buried histories. All the silenced voices finally speaking at once. The awakening of the continent in Africa. We felt it, not through official statements or editorials, but through something subtler, a shift in psychological gravity. For decades, we had looked outward for validation. We had sent our best minds to Harvard, Oxford, and Paris, hoping they might return sanctified by Western approval. But now, something reversed. An African-born man had not gone west to be educated. He had gone west to educate. That day, I realized that the colonial project had finally met its contradiction. It had tried to own Africa's labor, its minerals, its bodies. But now it had been conquered by Africa's ideas. The Baobab Momentes. I sat in my Pretoria study that night. The seed Mahmud had planted 20 years before split open like a heartbeat. I understood. Finally, the purpose of Baobab Savannah University. It was not simply an academic institution. It was a continent's reply to empire. A house of wisdom where Africa teaches itself again, where the farmer, the scholar, and the poet sit beneath one sky and remember who they are. I saw it clearly then. A green university built from earth, not marble. A campus without gates because truth belongs to no one. Students learning from the rhythm of rivers, the resilience of trees, and the memory of soil. A place where governance is taught as stewardship, not status. BSU was not just inspired by Mahmoud Mamdani's lectures. It was born from them. He had handed me a question. I'd spent 20 years building an answer. The last lesson empires do not die in war. They die in thought. They die when those they once subjugated begin to interpret the world through their own eyes. They die when truth becomes multilingual. They die when knowledge leaves the palace and walks barefoot into the village. And that is what BSU is. The Barefoot University. The place where empire's last illusion fades. The illusion that enlightenment belongs to the West. Every time a student in Africa learns to think freely, empire blinks. Every time a township child builds a solar lamp instead of waiting for power, empire blinks. Every time a farmer reads the weather in the wind rather than in imported models, empire blinks. Every time a young leader chooses conscience over career, empire blinks. Epilogue. The tree and the sky. The baobab has always fascinated me. A tree that looks upside down, its roots reaching into the air. They say it was planted that way by the Creator, so that it would never forget heaven even as it lived in the soil. That is how I see Africa now, rooted in the earth, reaching for the divine. And perhaps the Mamdanis, father, mother, and son, were the first branches of that great tree. They reminded the world that the African mind, once dismissed as primitive, is in truth the oldest and most enduring instrument of civilization. When empire blinked, Africa did not cheer. It simply smiled. The calm smile of the teacher watching the student finally understand. And beneath that smile, on this vast continent of sunlight and sorrow, the Baobab Savannah University rises quietly, not as an institution, but as an idea that whispers to every African child, you were never behind. The world was simply late to your genius. That is the meaning of the day empire blinked. It was not the end of history. It was the return of Africa. Chapter 7. The Return of the Pioneers. There are two caravans moving through time. The first was made of wagons, creaking, white-canvassed, pulled by oxen over Thornveld and Fear. The second was made of mines, carried not by wheels, but by will. Both belonged to South Africa, the echo of the trek nearly 2 centuries before Zohra Mamdani took the mayoral oath in New York. Another exodus was unfolding here at the southern tip of Africa. The year was 1836. Thousands of families packed their lives into wagons and turned their faces away from the Cape Colony toward an uncertain horizon. They were called Voortrekkers. Pioneers, but beneath the biblical language of deliverance lay something universal, a people leaving the known in search of space to breathe, to believe, to build. They crossed rivers that had no names, buried their dead beneath thorn trees, carved loggers against the night. They were stubborn, devout, flawed, and magnificent, all at once. And though history has argued about their motives, one truth remains. They were driven by the same restlessness that drives every human awakening, the refusal to be contained by the present. Let us repeat. Long before highways and maps, groups of Afrikaner farmers, known as Voortrekkers, meaning pioneers, after expressive systematic oppression from the British, packed their wagons and set out from the Cape Colony into the deep, dark, scary bushes in the interior. In that moment of rebellion, we glimpse something universal. The human refusal to be defined by another system. That moment in history, stripped of its politics and judged by its human core, reveals something profoundly universal. The refusal of the human spirit to remain captive under a system it did not design. In that sense, the Voortrekker story is not an Afrikaner story alone. It is a South African parable of autonomy, a mirror of every people who have sought to reclaim their dignity under domination. Just as the Voortrekkers resisted the British to define their own destiny, so would Black South Africans, generations later, rise to resist both British and Afrikaner oppression in pursuit of the same timeless goal, freedom on their own terms. And so they left. Families, children, and livestock, pulling wagons into an unknown interior filled with fever, famine, and predators. They crossed rivers, mountains, and plains crawling with lions, snakes, and disease. There were no roads, no guarantees, no government protection. Whatever one thinks of their politics or their legacy, the Voortrekkers, the Afrikaners did something extraordinary. They created paths where none existed. Through bush, veld, and danger, they carved trails with iron will and faith. From the great trek to the great thought. It is time to trek again. In the 1800s, wagons rolled northward through veld and valley. In the 2000s, ideas now roll outward from Africa to the world. The direction has reversed, but the destiny is the same, to pioneer a civilization rooted in conscience. The Great Trek was the geography of the body. The Baobab movement is the geography of the mind. The first built lagers to protect life. The second builds classrooms to protect truth. The first carried fear of the other. The second carries love for the whole. Both, however, were born from the same ancient hunger, the need to belong to something greater than survival. The reconciliation of the soil. When empire blinked in New York, it wasn't just the West that shifted. It was South Africa's soul calling for reconciliation with its own past. It whispered, "Stop hating your ancestors. Learn from all of them." The Voortrekkers, the Mamdanis, the Maponyas, the Mandelas, all were pilgrims of destiny. Each, in their own way, crossed deserts of disbelief to find a promised land within themselves. BSU's philosophy embraces them all. It teaches that history is not a battlefield of ownership, but a workshop of lessons. That every wagon trail and every exile's boat, every lecture and every song, are threads in the same tapestry. Because if we cannot forgive the past, we cannot pioneer the future. The Baobab Covenant. When I walk the grounds where BSU will one day stand, I imagine two monuments rising side by side. One, a replica of a Voortrekker wagon, symbol of movement. The other, a young baobab tree, symbol of rootedness. Together, they tell the story of South Africa's dual spirit, the wanderer and the witness, the trek and the tree. One always moving, the other always remembering, and somewhere between those two, a new civilization begins. One that does not erase its past, but redeems it. That is the meaning of the Baobab Covenant, to reconcile the pioneering spirit of the Voortrekkers with the moral imagination of Africa. To say once and for all that the trek never ended, it simply changed form. Epilogue. The endless road, as the sun sets over Pretoria. I imagine the old wagons disappearing into the horizon, their wheels turning not on land but on memory. And behind them rises the baobab, firm, serene, patient. Its branches stretch toward the same sky those pioneers once prayed beneath. And from that sky, a new dawn begins. The trek continues, not in dust and oxen, but in ideas and hope. The pioneers have returned, wearing new faces. They teach in classrooms, write in solitude, plant universities in red earth, and perhaps, one day, a young student at BSU will read this story, close the book, and whisper, "They thought the trek ended at Blood River, but it ended here, in the mind." Chapter 8. The Builders of the New Dawn. Every age ends twice. Once in blood, and once in understanding. South Africa has already shed its blood. Now it must find its understanding. The future will not be built by those who inherit power, but by those who inherit purpose. The age of builders. The pioneers of the 1800s carried wagons. The scholars of the 2000s carry laptops. Yet both are builders, seekers of a better order amid chaos. Ours is the generation that must bridge the two. We must take the endurance of the Voortrekker and the conscience of the philosopher and merge them into one ethic, to build not merely things, but meaning. The empires of yesterday built cathedrals and capitals. We must build integrity. They extracted wealth. We must extract wisdom. They erected walls of separation. We must plant forests of connection. The call of the soil, in the red soil of Africa. The bones of farmers, miners, and mothers lie side by side. No hierarchy, no tribe, no ideology. They whisper one message: grow something worth dying for. That is what BSU stands for. It is not a monument to intellect alone. It is a garden of renewal. Every graduate who leaves its gates must be a builder of communities, of conscience, of cohesion, because Africa's greatest resource is not gold, not oil, not diamonds. It is continuity. The courage to keep building even after betrayal, to keep believing even after disappointment. The new frontier. The Vortrekkers crossed mountains. The Mamdanis crossed empires. We must now cross ourselves. The frontier is no longer the Drakensberg, it is the human mind. To conquer ignorance is harder than to cross a desert. To forgive is harder than to farm. To remain ethical in a dishonest age is the new trek of our time. The pioneers of the 19th century conquered distance. The pioneers of the 21st must conquer despair. The synthesis of civilizations. Africa has always been the world's meeting ground. Greek thought met Nubian astronomy here. Arab trade met Bantu migration. European invention met indigenous endurance. Our destiny is not to imitate one civilization, but to synthesize them all. That is why BSU is not an African university in the narrow sense. It is a planetary school that speaks with an African accent. Its philosophy says, let us unite the fragments of human genius scattered across time. From Confucius to Smuts, from Mamdani to Mandela, from the Vortrekkers to the youth of Soshanguve, every philosophy of resilience belongs in the same library. The African Renaissance will not come from isolation, but from integration, from the humility to learn from all and the confidence to teach the world in return. The new builders. Who, then, are the new Vortrekkers? They are not armed with rifles or maps. They are armed with reason, empathy, and courage. They are the teachers, the farmers, the whistleblowers, the inventors, the nurses, the poets, the reformers. They are those who wake each day and refuse to surrender to decay. They are the builders of the new dawn. When they teach a child, plant a tree, expose a lie, or invent a better tool, they extend the great trek of conscience. Each small act of integrity becomes a wheel turning forward. The covenant of renewal. When the Vortrekkers set out, they made a covenant with God for victory in battle. Today, we must make a new covenant, not for victory, but for virtue. We must promise the future that we will build without plundering, believe without excluding, and lead without lying. We must agree that education without morality is dangerous, and morality without thought is blind. This is the covenant of renewal that BSU will inscribe into the nation's conscience. We, the heirs of many histories, pledge to pioneer the human spirit anew. Epilogue. The dawn over the baobab as dawn breaks over the savannah. The light touches the baobab before it reaches the city. The tree stands in silhouette, vast, unhurried, eternal. In its shadow, a group of students gather, notebooks in hand, eyes full of wonder. They are discussing a lecture on the ethics of the next civilization. One of them asks, "What is the purpose of history?" And another replies softly, "To teach us how to begin again." Above them, the sky glows red, the same red that guided the Vortrekkers, the same red soil that nourished the Mamdanis, the same red ink in which Africa continues to write her story. That red is not the color of war anymore. It is the color of awakening. And so the trek continues. Through knowledge, through conscience, through the endless road of the African spirit. Because the pioneers have returned, and they are building the dawn. Chapter 9. The silence before civilization. Civilizations do not begin with noise. They begin with silence, the kind that comes before the word, before the flag, before the first law is written. Silence is not emptiness. It is the waiting of meaning. That is where Africa stands now, not in ruin, but in waiting. We are standing at the threshold of our own renaissance, listening for the new sound of ourselves. The language of beginnings. The first pioneers had wagons, the next had books. But the last pioneers, the ones who will define the next age, will have listening. Listening is the act of civilization in its purest form. To listen is to govern without tyranny, to teach without arrogance, to heal without superiority. For too long, the world has spoken over Africa. Economists, aid workers, politicians, investors, and all talking, all diagnosing, all prescribing. Now, the world must learn to listen, and Africa, too, must listen to herself, to her prophets, to her rivers, to her silences. The voice of the baobab if trees could speak. The baobab would sound like a wise old sage who has outlived empires. It doesn't shout, it waits. Its trunk stores water for seasons of thirst. Its shade offers peace for those who wander. That is why the Baobab Savannah University begins not with lectures, but with reflection. Every student is required to sit in silence before the first lesson, not as ritual, but as reorientation. They must unlearn the noise of the world to hear the whisper of wisdom. For the greatest danger of our age is not ignorance, but distraction. People know everything and understand nothing. They hear constantly but never listen deeply. The Baobab teaches otherwise. It says, grow slowly, store wisdom, speak only when it heals. The theology of stillness. When empire blinked, it wasn't conquered by armies. It was undone by reflection. Because silence is not the absence of power. It is the discipline of power. From the deserts of the sand to the monasteries of the Coptic, from the meditative drums of the Zulu to the chants of the Sufi, Africa has always known that before the world is transformed, the soul must first be still. It is this ancient African theology that BSU revives, that the universe is not a marketplace of noise, but a symphony of reverence. The true scholar must be half monk, half warrior, contemplative in peace, decisive in action. The politics of listening in government. I have sat in meetings where everyone spoke and no one heard. Policies were drafted, frameworks debated, funds allocated, yet wisdom was absent. That is because governance without silence is just noise written in policy language. BSU trains its future leaders differently. Before strategy, there is study. Before action, there is awareness. Before leadership, there is listening. Every great reform begins not with a manifesto, but with a moment of humility. The kind of humility that says, maybe I don't know yet. That is the silence before civilization, the sacred pause. In the age of machines and markets, the pause has become a rebellion. To pause is to reclaim time from transaction. To pause is to give the mind permission to breathe. BSU's philosophy declares that the pause is not laziness, it is alignment. Because speed without direction is chaos. Noise without meaning is madness. When the pioneers stopped their wagons at sunset, they weren't resting. They were listening to the land, the sky, the divine. The same must be true of the new pioneers of thought. For civilization is not built by those who rush, but by those who remember, the covenant of quiet strength. Every student who walks through BSU's gate reads a single inscription carved in stone. Before you speak to the world, listen to the silence that made it. It is both a command and a comfort. It reminds us that the next civilization will not be born through arrogance, but through humility. It will not begin with slogans, but with stillness. In that stillness, we hear the echo of the first word ever spoken, and the promise that one day, humanity will speak again, but this time with wisdom. Epilogue. The listening continent. As the sun sets across the African savanna, the wind moves through the grass like breath. You can almost hear it, the continent inhaling, preparing, remembering. The West has spoken enough. Now Africa listens, not to be passive, but to understand. And when she finally speaks again, the world will fall silent, for it will recognize that the first civilization has not perished. It has merely been contemplating. Chapter 10. The age of the Baobab civilizations have seasons. There was the age of stone when survival was craft. The age of bronze when conquest was genius. The age of steel when progress roared louder than conscience. And now, quietly, the world enters the age of the Baobab, an age when wisdom must stand taller than wealth. The return of the root. The Baobab is not merely a tree. It is a metaphor for civilization itself. Its roots spread wider than its height, anchoring it against drought and storm. Its trunk holds water enough to outlast famine. Its fruit feeds, its bark heals, its shadow cools. So must the new civilization be. Deeply rooted, self-sustaining, generous in shade. The Baobab Savannah University is not a school built of brick. It is a root system of minds. Each graduate becomes a taproot descending into the community, carrying nourishment where the soil has grown thin. In the age of the Baobab, knowledge is not extracted. It is cultivated. Leadership is not performed. It is lived. The moral climate. For too long we measured climate by temperature and rainfall. But there is another climate, the moral climate. And it, too, is overheating. Greed burns forests faster than fire. Indifference melts empathy faster than ice. The Baobab age demands restoration, not only of nature, but of nature within. It asks us to remember that stewardship is a spiritual act, that to heal the earth, one must first heal one's motives. In this age, policy without ethics is pollution. Technology without humility is drought. Progress without purpose is extinction in disguise. The architecture of wisdom, look at a baobab trunk, thick, uneven, scarred. No two are alike, yet all are enduring. That is how the architecture of the new world must be built. Not uniform, but unified. Not perfect, but enduring. BSU's blueprint is the same. Philosophy as foundation, science as structure, art as air, ethics as roof. Its graduates will not leave with degrees alone, but with a sense of moral geometry, the knowledge that every line of progress must return to a circle of care. From pioneers to planters, the Voortrekkers crossed the veld. The Mamdanis crossed ideas. We, in this century, must cross ourselves, from pioneers into planters. A pioneer breaks new ground. A planter ensures it lives. A pioneer seeks freedom. A planter nurtures continuity. The age of the baobab calls for planters, leaders who sow peace in place of pride, teachers who water curiosity instead of conformity, citizens who understand that democracy is a garden, not a guarantee. The spiritual economy in this new civilization, value will no longer be measured in currency, but in contribution. The richest nation will be the one that wastes the least potential. The strongest economy will be the one that exports empathy. The highest interest will be earned in kindness. Africa, with its untapped moral capital, stands poised to lead this transformation. For what the world calls underdeveloped is often just under-listened to. And when Africa finally speaks from its baobab pulpits, its universities, its villages, its innovators, the world will remember what abundance really means. The covenant of the century, every century signs its own covenant with time. The 20th century promised power and delivered pollution. The 21st must promise balance and deliver belonging. The covenant of the age of the baobab is simple. We shall not grow taller than our roots. It means no progress that forgets its people, no wealth that abandons its purpose, no technology that erases tenderness. It means that every decision, from policy to prayer, must pass one test. Does it restore life? The lamp and the shadow at dusk, the baobab casts a shadow long enough to touch the horizon. Children play in that shade. Elders rest there. Poets write there. That shadow is not darkness. It is continuity. In the same way, the Baobab Savannah University must cast its own moral shadow across the nation. A cool space for weary souls, a refuge for thought, a reminder that intellect and kindness need not quarrel, because civilization is not defined by skyscrapers, but by how gently we stand among the broken. Epilogue. The circle returns. The circle is complete. From a boy in Pretoria who met a philosopher and his son, to the founding of a university rooted in that encounter, to a continent rediscovering its courage, the trek has come home. The empire blinked, the baobab bloomed, and the builders began. And so this story, like the tree itself, will keep growing. For the age of the baobab is not an era on a calendar. It is a way of being in the world, rooted in the soil, reaching for the sun, and teaching every wandering civilization that the tallest tree is the one that remembers its seed. Afterward, the man who became a tree. I began this journey in the quiet aisles of a library, among the dust of books, the hum of ideas, and the soft discipline of solitude. I did not know then that I was already standing in a sanctuary. I only knew that books felt like home. Those early years taught me reverence, not for paper and print, but for the invisible force that turns thought into life. In every book I cataloged, I sensed a seed. In every idea, a root waiting for rain. I didn't yet know that one day, those roots would take the form of a university, and that my life's work would become a tree. The long road, through the state. When I joined the Department of Public Service and Administration, I believed that governance was the architecture of justice. I thought the system could be repaired by logic, policy, and planning. But with time, I discovered something both painful and profound. The crisis of governance was not in the paperwork. It was in the people work. The documents were sound. The framework's impressive. But the human spirit, the moral software of the nation, had grown weary. We were efficient without being ethical, articulate without being awake. I realized that the nation's illness was not administrative. It was existential. We had lost our rhythm, our philosophy, our inward compass. And that insight became the first whisper of Baobab Savannah University. The Cambridge moment years later. Standing in the ancient halls of Cambridge, I experienced something that felt less like achievement and more like visitation. During the graduation ceremony, I slipped into a trance-like stillness, as if time itself had paused to ask me a question. It wasn't pride that filled me, but a deep calling. The Latin hymns, the echo of robes, the centuries of scholarship. They were beautiful, yes, but they also felt foreign, distant, borrowed. I knew, standing there in that English chapel, that I did not belong to that tradition alone. I belonged to the soil that had shaped me. Africa's wild intellect, ancient, uncontained, unschooled, but immeasurably wise. That moment crystallized my conviction. Africa did not need to imitate the world's universities. It needed to remember itself. The founding of BSU. When I returned home, the vision of Baobab Savannah University grew naturally. Not from ambition, but from alignment. It was not founded to compete with Oxford or Harvard, but to complete something those institutions had forgotten: the unity between knowledge and reverence, intellect and nature. BSU was to be the first university that breathes. A green university where the curriculum follows the rhythm of the land, where students learn that progress without peace is failure, and that philosophy is not abstract thought, but the daily discipline of goodness. In its halls, silence is a subject. Listening is a leadership skill. Ethics is not a course, it is the campus itself. Savaro, the philosophy of stillness. Out of this soil of reflection grew Savaro, my personal philosophy, born from years of walking the Karoo, of listening to the desert's sermons, of realizing that the land itself is a teacher. Savaro, a fusion of savannas and Karoo, is the belief that wisdom emerges when vastness meets vulnerability. It teaches that solitude is not loneliness, that silence is not emptiness, that stillness is not stagnation. To live the Savaro way is to stand like the baobab, rooted, resilient, receptive, drawing nourishment from both soil and sky. The covenant of the soul. I have seen empires fall, governments decay, heroes falter, but I have never seen a soul that walks with integrity perish. That is why my life's work is not political, but philosophical, to restore to South Africa its soul of wisdom. BSU is my offering to that cause, a covenant between the earth and the intellect. It is where governance becomes conscience, where public service becomes soul work, and where education becomes a ritual of remembrance. Because every society that forgets its inner life dies, no matter how advanced its outer life becomes. The man who became a tree, sometimes I think of Mahmoud Mamdani's visit to Pretoria in 2005. I see myself again, younger, curious, uncertain, watching him speak of empire's illusions and the colonized mind. I did not know then that he was planting me. Now I have become what he planted, a man grown into a tree of thought. And like the baobab, I live not for one generation, but for all who seek shade, water, and wisdom. The roots of my work spread beneath the soil of South Africa, but its branches reach toward the world. It is a continuation of everything that came before, from the pioneers of the veld to the philosophers of Kampala, from the silence of the Karoo to the noise of New York. Closing benediction to the reader, I say this: if you have journeyed with me through these 10 chapters, then you are already part of the covenant. Go out and plant something: an idea, a school, a friendship, a future. Protect it, water it, believe in it. For every seed of integrity planted in African soil is an act of defiance against despair. And when the next generation asks where the new civilization began, tell them it began here, with a man who once listened to a philosopher and decided to become a tree. Chris Kanyane, founder, Baobab Savannah University, Pretoria, South Africa. The holistic covenant. All things that endure have one secret: they understand wholeness. The mountain, the river, the family, the nation, the soul, each exists not as an isolated thing, but as a living part of something greater. That, I have come to realize, is the law that binds existence: holism. It is not just a philosophy. It is the structure of life itself, the eternal marriage of parts and purpose, the seed of wholeness. When I first met Professor Mahmoud Mamdani in 2005, I did not know that he was awakening my holistic instinct, the sense that no single discipline, nation, or ideology can explain the human story. His lecture on empire made me see that politics, economics, psychology, and history are not separate sciences. but symptoms of the same consciousness. That day, something ancient in me stirred. An understanding that the mind, the society, and the cosmos move as one organism. To heal one, you must heal all. That was the beginning of my holistic awakening. Holism in the Journey. The chapters of this book, from the philosopher who carried a continent to the age of the baobab, are not separate stories. They are the limbs of one body. Mahmoud Mamdani was the mind. Mira Nair was the heart. Zohra and Mamdani became the hands. The Vortrekkers were the feet, trudging through history. And BSU, Baobab Savannah University, became the spine that now holds it all upright. Each chapter is an organ of the same being. Africa rediscovering its wholeness. Smuts and the spirit of integration. It was John Smuts, soldier, statesman, philosopher, who gave the world the word holism. In 1926, he wrote, "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It creates the parts, and in the end, it perfects them." Smuts saw that life is not mechanical, it is creative. Every part of the universe strives toward integration, coherence, and consciousness. I realize now that everything I have written, everything I have lived, is a continuation of that same principle. Where Smuts applied it to evolution, I apply it to civilization. Where he saw the unity of the atom and the organism, I see the unity of the individual and the nation. BSU, in this sense, is holism made human. It is an institution that restores relationship between mind and morality, between education and ecology, between the African and the world. The holistic state, my years at the Department of Public Service and Administration, taught me that governance divorced from humanity becomes machinery, cold, efficient, and soulless. But holism teaches that government is not a machine. It is a living system, and public servants are its cells. Each must act not only for the self, but for the organism. That is what it means to serve ethically, to understand that a corrupt act in one department weakens the whole body of the state. In this way, holism becomes more than theory. It becomes the moral grammar of governance. Holism and Savaro, my personal philosophy born from the Karoo and the Savannahs, is the African voice of holism. Where Smuts found unity in evolution, Savaro finds unity in existence. It is the belief that the land, the mind, and the divine are not three things but three names for the same being. In the silence of the desert, I learned what Smuts understood in his study at Doornkloof, that to be human is to participate in the living totality of the world. Every action reverberates through the web of being. Every good deed repairs the fabric. Every act of integrity strengthens the spine of civilization. That is why I say, the African heart was always holistic. It never saw separation between body and soul, person and planet, tribe and tribe. Savaro is simply holism spoken in African rhythm. The baobab as symbol of holism. The baobab embodies this truth in flesh and bark. It looks upside down, roots in the sky, branches in the ground. Yet it thrives. Why? Because it has learned the secret: balance. Its life depends not on domination but reciprocity. It gives as much as it takes, so too must civilization. BSU was envisioned not as a ladder to climb, but as a tree to belong to, where each student is a leaf, each teacher a branch, and each generation a season in the same enduring life. The baobab, like holism, teaches that strength lies in synthesis, the great reconciliation. When I stood at the Vortrekker monument years later, looking up at the carvings of ox wagons and granite settlers, I did not see colonizers or victims. I saw fragments of the same whole, the restless spirit of humanity moving across the land, searching for belonging. In that moment, I understood holism not as science, but as forgiveness. It dissolves hatred by reminding us that the enemy is never another race or nation. The enemy is disconnection. What apartheid divided, holism now unites. What ideology fractured, consciousness must heal. This is South Africa's unfinished project. Not only political democracy, but ontological reconciliation, the healing of being itself, the new covenant of wholeness. And so, as the sun sets over Pretoria and the baobab's shadow stretches long, I make this covenant, the same covenant I invite every reader, every student, every citizen to share. We shall think as one, act as one, and heal as one, for the world is one organism, and its heart beats in Africa. This is not a metaphor, it is a moral law. To violate it is to sicken the world. To honor it is to save it. The future will not belong to nations or empires, but to wholes, to civilizations that live in harmony with themselves and the planet. The age of the baobab is, therefore, the age of holism, where the intellect and the spirit, the pioneer and the philosopher, the black and the white, the African and the universal, finally recognize themselves as one body breathing the same breath. The final benediction: I began as a librarian, I became a civil servant, and I will die a teacher. But beyond all titles, I am a cell in the body of the whole, and that is enough. If this book has taught anything, let it be this: that wholeness is holiness, that to serve the whole is to serve God, and that every act of integrity, no matter how small, restores the rhythm of the universe. So may the baobab grow, may the pioneers rest, may the empire sleep, and may the world awaken, unified, forgiving, and whole. Chris Kanyane, founder, Baobab Savannah University, Pretoria, South Africa. Would you like me to follow this with a short philosopher's appendix, a page or two summarizing the principles of holism for the African Renaissance, almost like Smuts' ideas reinterpreted for your era? Mind, society, nature, governance, God? It would serve as a compact intellectual conclusion, ideal for readers and students at BSU.